It was a busy Tynwald this week, and while ongoing tensions between some members didn't surface, they continued to simmer just below the radar. We'll hear later from the Treasury Minister, the Infrastructure Minister, the Chair of the Rebalancing Committee, Michelle Hayward MHK, and Rob Collister MHK. But first, the Chief Minister. Today you answered a question from Claire Christian about the Economic Development Fund. You talked about something like £33 million worth of the fund has been committed, but how much of that has actually been spent?
Yeah, so first of all, we will produce a full report into our spending, as you would expect, in terms of what has actually been drawn down from the fund and what has been committed. When we set the fund up, its actual total was about £115 million, and we did merge in various existing funds, including some of the financial assistance schemes that are with Department for Enterprise at the moment. So there was a number of allocated expenditure already given, albeit some of that hadn't been drawn down. And included within that £33 million figure I gave was the £10 million that Tynwald had supported in terms of the Island Infrastructure Scheme. As yet, though, we have not seen the full details as to how that gets drawn down. So there's still quite some time to go before I can provide full clarity on that. But nevertheless, I've been asked a question. It's important that I give the correct information to Tynwald. And I also indicated there was also a major potential project in the pipeline. But before we drew down on that, I said it was our intention to come to Tynwald to have that drawn down. So it'll be another 6 to 12 months before you get full clarity on absolutely where all the detail is, because some of it's been allocated, but as yet confirmation not been received that it has been drawn down.
And of course, what the public perhaps don't appreciate is that the whole way in which spending is reported across government is it's complex, because there's lots of areas there, and you really need to have to wait to the end of a financial year to fully understand how to give an answer to what seems like a fairly obvious question: how much have you spent?
Well, I think it's absolutely fair that the question is being asked in terms of what's really happening with our Economic Strategy Board, what's happening with the Economic Development Fund. I think the critical point is that one, I provide some transparency that yes, a number of actions are currently being undertaken, some of which are very clear in terms of the Island Infrastructure Scheme. Some of the DFE allocation of spend is yet to be drawn down, but we'll give clarity on that. The more important thing is, are we actually driving the economy forward? And as I said in my answer, the best information that I have from Islandman statistics and the independent information that's been given is that we are over 650 jobs positive to when this administration started out. That similar number is reflected in the population growth. And if you take those as just simple standalone statistics alongside what we've targeted in our island plan for jobs growth and population, then I think we've got some foundations to say that it is proving to be a success. And of course, one has to factor in, we've achieved that also alongside very strong economic headwinds of high inflation, global energy price, significant fluctuations, and of course the general economic conditions. So, I think that we are setting out to achieve our objectives. We've already got good evidence in the first 18 months or so of this administration that we delivered on that, but I think the real proof of the pudding will come in the next 6 to 12 months when I deliver the annual report, which I intend to do in November, regarding the Economic Strategy Board and the Development Fund, and also by the time we get to the next budget in April 2024, we'll have greater insight.
It's fair to say Claire Christian didn't appear to be impressed when she asked the question, how are you going to measure return on investment for this fund? And your answer appeared to be more jobs and more people living on the island.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a very, very basic interpretation in terms of the measures that I have at the moment. And and I know that statistics take time to produce, so it can't always tell it right up to date, but the best information I have, it is working, and we need more clarity on that. But it's not just about the jobs and the numbers in the population. We've set out an ambitious plan, an ambitious island plan, an economic strategy that is driven on data from the information that we received when we undertook that big review in 2022 and 2021, and subsequently produced the foundations for the economic strategy to move forward. And of course, elements like GDP, housing, for example, the island infrastructure, health, education, all these are important measures as well. And, it's not just about that, but the question was really about the economic fund, the generation of economic activity, investment activity, and that's really the foundations of the answer that I gave.
How can people possibly be expected to invest in the Isle of Man, to create new jobs, create new roles in the island, if they can't even be guaranteed of arriving on the Isle of Man or leaving the Isle of Man on the even in the same week that they thought they were booked?
Yeah, well, so I'm very concerned about the problems that we've had at the airport, as is everybody. In fact, the Council of Ministers have been following our sort of strategic positioning when it comes to air services quite closely, and we expect to review that in the whole in the coming months. But nevertheless, on this specific issue, clearly the Department for Infrastructure, the airport management have faced a number of issues which have seen a very significant sort of staffing crisis emerge, given the CAA rules around that and the limitations in terms of when people must take breaks. They've delivered the current roster, and we've seen some of the impacts about that. But bear in mind, it's not just them. I mean, we've had a lot of disruption in the airline industry, and there's been a lot of flight delays and indeed cancellations, and they've had nothing to do with the airport whatsoever. Nevertheless, absolutely understand the urgency of this. We are discussing it with the DOI, the Airport Management Council, are going to get an update on Thursday, and we're going to explore whether there are other options for us to deliver consistency in the service levels in the short to medium term whilst this situation gets resolved. And that's not to say the DOI, of course, have not been sitting twiddling their thumbs. They've made active recruitment. They've taken active recruitment measures. We will get air traffic controllers back up to the levels necessary to have the airport fully operational throughout any given period of opening. But yes, it's difficult. We're looking at the solutions. If we can find that solution, we're going to get it implemented.
Is this partly as a result of obviously COVID? The island was locked down for significant periods of time. Air travel tailed off, and perhaps the eye was taken off the ball a little bit by a previous administration in that there wasn't that much flight in and out of the island, therefore it didn't feel as though this was an issue. And then suddenly people have decided, actually, we're quite happy to travel again, and it's become the issue it's become.
Yeah, I think all that's probably valid in some way, although I haven't got the absolute in-depth explanations or interpretations, but those suggestions probably resonate. Nevertheless, we need to change our approach. We need to get the full resourcing back in play, and of course recognise that we are the airline. The strategic approach that we're taking, the airport, is integral to us achieving the success that we're outlining in the island plan. So, but we're not the only airport across the British Isles to have suffered problems. I mean, Glasgow, for example, has had to shut recently down because it hasn't had the air traffic control numbers. I know. From talking to the airport director and from my own research, there is a real demand for air traffic controllers, not just in the UK but also globally as well. And a lot. And yes, some of this is clearly attributable to the COVID period when perhaps some of the training was disrupted particularly, but also we've had pressures on staffing and staff resources, not just in air traffic control but in other critical areas across the public service. Phil, I think the main message from me today to the public is that we're taking this very seriously. We're going to be examining this in absolute detail in the coming days. And if we can find a solution to bring consistency back and confidence back in terms of airline arrivals and departures on the island, then we will look to see whether that's feasible to bring in a changed operational procedure in order to achieve that.
Because this is crucial, isn't it? I mean, effectively, there are... most of the people in the Isle of Man have been affected in some way by this disruption in travel, and I think people, whilst they could maybe understand a few months of disruption, this does seem to be going on, and there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, it hasn't been helped by the the changes that took place on the infrastructure when it came to land, airport landing systems, and maybe that masks some of the problems that have been experienced. Yes, this has become a more pressing issue because of one or two staffing issues that have subsequently occurred, meaning the available staff available to the airport director has decreased effectively. He's had to put in place a roster in accordance with to CAA regulations for safety, for flight safety, and I'm afraid my understanding is that it's not that simple, and simply going out, finding an air traffic controller from Heathrow or Gatwick and then just simply bringing them to the Isle of Man. That option just does not exist without giving them also substantial training in different areas of operational procedure that are particular to the island, and also the difference in the scope of their duties that they have to undertake when they're operating in the Isle of Man as opposed to some of these major airports. If there was a simple solution, we would have implemented it by now. We're going to have those discussions in depth later this week, and if, as I said, if there is a solution that we can implement that will work, then we intend to try and bring that forward.
One of the other frustrations, I think, that the public appear to have in relation to this government is that they see the bold promises, the big policies, and the strategies, but they're not seeing as much delivery as perhaps they would have liked, or maybe they've expected. One of the areas that you were questioned on in Tynwald was in relation to the Office of Human Resource, and it's clear that still there are many of the senior roles in government not filled. They currently have acting chief executives. When are we going to start seeing these posts filled, and presumably then some more actions being able to be taken, because you'll have long-term people in the senior roles?
Well, we're putting in a number of foundations to change the performance of government and also strengthen the way that chief officers and the chief executive officer ultimately are able to be held both accountable, but able to hopefully have a better environment in which to deliver their responsibilities. And some of this takes time in a government that is pressed to deliver a huge number of public services on the back of some of the problems that we've experienced from COVID, and we're overcoming those, and we're starting to transition back to normality. But also we've set out a bold, ambitious program for delivery to put us into a much, much better position for the future, and to overcome some of the critical challenges that we're facing around demographics. We've always had choices in terms of how we do things, Phil, and this government settled to set out that ambitious program, drive towards that, and have to accept that we've got to challenge also some of the critical challenges that we've got around public service delivery, and do that in an environment, I might add, that has been, as I've already said in this interview, financially very, very, very challenging for everybody. Global economic circumstances, inflation, global energy prices, but also, and one of the worldwide global impacts of COVID has been this shrinking workforce, and yet I'm able to demonstrate to people from this Isle of Man statistics evidence that we've got, that we've actually managed to start growing the working population. So it is a balance. Yes, there's lots of challenges around, but I still remain optimistic that we are delivering on our high-level commitments, and I expect by the end of this parliamentary year to have further evidence of that, particularly when it comes to energy and both our climate change commitments, but also our future energy security as well.
I'm generally quick to understand and sympathise with government departments that are clearly struggling to spread depleted resources thinly and still maintain a reasonable service. But even I am struggling to understand the sorry state at the airport. Chris Thomas's ministerial head is on the airport chopping block, and the public are in a chopping mood.
The Isle of Man government cares about air connectivity, hasn't cared quite enough in the last 12 months. The airport budget claims didn't quite get to the number one priority, and they need to be at the number one priority in certain spaces. For a couple of years, we've been working with airlines to improve connectivity, and a lot of things are going wrong because airlines are scheduling their flights to the Isle of Man at the end of the day rather than at the beginning of the day, so technical problems and air traffic control issues in other parts of Europe build up during the day. But I was delighted that EasyJet made a statement about things like weather over Gatwick this last week or so, other issues that they've had. Was delighted myself personally to engage with another airline about these sorts of things, and I really hope that the public understands that the government, the Department of Infrastructure, me, myself personally, the Chief Minister, taking this very, very seriously, and we need to have better airline connectivity or we're in a mess. For the last 30 years, whenever we ask the people of the Isle of Man what's the worst thing about living on our island, it's always getting on and off the island, and now is a particularly bad moment in that history.
And we are in that mess at the moment. And, your government, one of its ambitions is to grow the economy. How on earth is it going to do that if people can't rely on flights to and from the Isle of Man? It's all right, all well and good saying that you take this seriously, but people aren't seeing any significant change.
It's not about writing reports and it's not about strategizing, it's about doing stuff. So at the airport, I said when I came in as Minister about a year ago that the airport and buses were my immediate priorities. Buses ran on time over TT, and there was a huge increase in numbers using them. Over the TT period, there was nearly a 20% increase in the people travelling to the Isle of Man by air. That caused its problems in its own self because people, weren't allowed to take holiday. In principle, we've got the right number of posts in air traffic control.
When you say people weren't allowed to take their holidays, are you meaning the travelling public or people at the airport?
People in the airport. We had that's the moment perhaps when the Isle of Man's most visible to more people, because there's so much travelling going on around the TT that it was absolutely vital that things went smoothly, and they went smoothly. And thank you very much to everybody going beyond. We've got issues in the tower that money itself can't buy a solution to. We need to back cleverly, and that's what we're doing. So working with the DHSC about arrangements around emergency patient transfer, working to imagine every possible way that the CAA could help us in terms of their regulation, working with airlines to understand that they can do everything they can. Most importantly, the public needs to understand that they travel with an airline and they fly, that those airlines fly to the airport. So the response to this has got to be about working together. I've been personally apologising to everybody for the inconvenience. I accept the problem. I am Minister of Infrastructure. I know the Chief Minister cares about this passionately, and together we're doing everything we can to get better airline connectivity. And there's things are going on at the airport. We are recruiting more people. We are working to support people as they complete their training, because it's a pretty difficult path to become a qualified air traffic controller. We've got other pinch points around the airport.
And do we actually have enough air traffic controllers? And what is the issue surrounding all that?
It's one of those professions like being a pilot that you've got people's lives in your hands. So therefore, if there's anything wrong with you physically or mentally, you can't go to work. If you do anything wrong, there's an investigation. It takes a lot of time to train to such an important position where people's lives are in your hands. Safety is absolutely paramount, and it doesn't help having the public blaming a small group of people. So they've got that group of people have got my full support, the Chief Minister's full support, and we're doing everything we possibly can, working with the airlines to make sure that we have the best possible air connectivity. We've got other pinch points around the airport. So, for instance, baggage is an issue, working with the private contractor that does baggage to make changes that the public will begin to hear about soon. We're working with security. Today I answer questions about the new type of scanners that we could spend money on to introduce to make the passage through security easier. We need to improve the way we communicate in terms of information on the about arrivals and departures. There's lots of little practical things. It's not about putting together a report. It's not about putting together a select committee. It's about doing things, spending money, working with people, working with airlines to make the situation better, and that's what I've been doing for 12 months, and we're beginning to see progress. And apologies to the public for the inconvenience. Air connectivity, their personal air connectivity from the island really matters to me, to the Chief Minister, to government, and I think every member of Tynwald. And just apologies for any inconvenience this last week, back in March, when the weather really contrived against us. I hope to be able to win people back over in the next month with making some practical announcements to show that the hard work that so many people have been doing over the last year is actually coming to fruition.
Cynics could perhaps be justified in suggesting that maybe this is a marketing ploy on the part of the government-owned steam packet company, actually to try and move people away from air travel onto the boats. Do you understand the significant level of frustration that the Manx public are actually feeling over this?
Yeah, I understand it, I get it, I accept it. The buck stops with me as Minister of Infrastructure, as a person who's building an airport board around the airport management team and the staff there to offer them support and challenge. What I would say in response to that suggestion that we're doing this to take revenue at the steam packet is I'd say, no, that's not the case. For instance, between last year's TT and this year's TT, nearly 20% more passengers went through the airport. Steam packet passengers seem to be down very slightly. Admittedly, between 2019 and 2022, it's the other way around. There has been that period over those 3 years periods, but that's just because the aviation sector has suffered during COVID. People just haven't been flying as much as they were before. And our airport's problems, although everybody in the island is myopically thinking that's just about our problems and it's the rubbish DOI and it's rubbish government and it's rubbish Tynwald and it's rubbish MHKs, in actual fact you'll find that our airport's problems are mirrored, perhaps not to such a great extent, at a lot of airports around the British Isles at the moment, and the fact that we're on the edge and on the margins of airline services is something that we've got to address. So I made it my personal pledge 12 months ago that the airport and buses were my initial priority. We've done lots of other things in those last 12 months. We've had more success in the public's eye on buses than we have as yet in the airlines, but I can genuinely state here that I care. I'm sorry personally for every trauma that everybody's had. I was pleased to receive from Mr. Murphy, new OFT board member, his petition on behalf of people who've suffered travelling with EasyJet, and I'll be responding to that later in the week. And basically, we need to work with the airlines to make air connectivity better, and the experience of getting on a plane like it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Don't go away. Much more after the break. As a seasoned Tynwald observer, it's rare for the members' actions to surprise me, but I was surprised that Tynwald spent nearly 3 hours looking into the nooks and crannies as to whether or not the bishop should retain a place in Tynwald, while nodding through, with little comment, the Committee on Rebalancing the Population's quite revolutionary report. Did Chair of the Committee, Michelle Hayward MHK, share my surprise?
Yeah, I think I am. I thought members would have more to say about it, and I thought some of our proposals were fairly far-reaching, and I expected to have members sort of, almost clamouring to have themselves associated with those concepts, but no, didn't seem to. Maybe they're just content, happy to vote for it.
But in relation to your motion, I mean, as you say, there are some fairly far-reaching concepts that have been put, new ideas, new proposals. Government had a bit of a kind of a, well, we're doing a lot of this stuff already type of an amendment that some of which was supported by members. But on the whole, you got most of what you were looking for through, and it is far-reaching what you've proposed.
It is. I think you could look at the recommendations in two ways. One was, how does Tynwald handle this? How do we handle this problem? And how do we deal with it? And there were lots of government amendments around embedding it into existing structures, and that's fine. The other one was a far-reaching package of support measures for families, which I think when we wrote it and we put them in, we went, they'll never go for this. And if they go for one of these things, we'll be happy. And actually, we seem to have scored on a huge package of support for families, the like of which I don't think has ever been passed by Tynwald before.
And obviously, the other burning question of the day is, how on earth are we going to pay for all the different things? Where are we? How are we going to address the funding gap between tax and spend that we have? In a way, this does address this, doesn't it?
I think the thing to recognise is if you extend childcare vouchers down to the age of 1, what's happening is that allows mums to go back to work. and within a year of stopping your career you can usually step back in. But it also then creates demand for local nurseries because more families can afford to send their child to the local nursery, and that's money that's all going back into the local economy. This is not money that's being spent off island, and then that frees up money within those family budgets for them to be able to afford to do other things like live here on the island and go out and enjoy life here. So I think that that's just a huge help for families to be able to afford their mortgage, to be able to afford childcare, to be able to go back into work knowing that those spaces are going to be there ultimately.
Anything that was amended out of the motion that you are disappointed about? Bearing in mind, I mean, on the whole, you're happy, but were there bits that perhaps members allowed to drop that should have stayed in?
There's a strange one, I think, because we'd suggested an uplift to maternity allowance, a substantial and urgent uplift, and the Treasury commented that we'd already done some movement in that on the budget. But in their amendment, they'd included the commitment to look at paternity and adoption allowance as well. And there was kind of a vote against that, but I think it's because it didn't have a scale and it didn't have a time frame to it. So members wanted to see something much larger and much sooner. I anticipate that Treasury, acting in the interests of fairness, will include paternity and adoption allowance in that review as well. So, I hope that we will just see a fair and equitable approach from them.
And it is fair to say that you had a fairly ambitious timetable, which was amended. Expecting a report approved in June 23, Tynwald, and one of the recommendations is to report back by June 23. That's ambitious, isn't it?
I think at the time we wrote it, which was in December 2022, it wasn't ambitious. But what's happened is we met with Comyn to go through their potential amendments, and then we pushed back. And so one of the things that they were minded not to agree with was the childcare extension to 1. We've seen that the UK are doing that by 2025. We can't afford to be out of step with them, and in fact, if anything, we need to be better if we're going to keep working families here and support them properly. So we pushed back very, very hard, and that went away again to Comyn to have another look at it, and so they then didn't amend that when it came through today. So that whole time frame is stretched on. There is a report today on the order paper that is about the statistics that are available, but our recommendation was specifically about what does the future look like and what do you need. And so as far as it goes, it's a report that tells you what's available and what the problems are, and we'd already experienced that as a committee. What it doesn't do is say what does the future look like and how do we improve that. So there's a deadline now for them to come back with the suggested improvements.
And I suppose people listening to this may be surprised to learn that, maybe pleasantly surprised to learn that committees actually talk to council and ministers and try and win arguments before the matter is aired publicly. Was that a good process? Was it an unusual process?
I think it's common for committees to have a chat with Comyn, especially if there are amendments coming through. It's a matter of courtesy, if nothing else. But certainly that first sight that we had of some of the amendments, we did push back very hard because it's things that we really believed would make a difference. And so Tynwald originally said, come up with workable solutions. And workable solutions come if you can take existing mechanisms and adapt them and expand them rather than trying to put new schemes in, because that takes you infinitely longer. We already have childcare support down to the age of 3. It's meant to be coming down to the age of 2 in the childcare strategy. Turns out that was a bit of a limited one. Now it's universal down to the age of 1. So that's a huge step, but it's using an existing scheme. So it's not too far into the realms of having to write new schemes out that it'll slow things down enormously. So we push back on the really big things that we thought would make a big difference to families, and that's what this is about.
And I suppose as well then, going back to the kind of the fundamental here, what is the burning question that this whole committee report actually seeks to address?
So essentially, if we look at the structure of our population, we know we've got a kind of, from age 55 and upwards, we've got quite a lot of people in those age groups. And some of them are still working, but some of them are coming towards retirement. So that gives us a big sort of, well, not quite burden on society, but it does give us how we need to structure things a bit differently for that ageing population. When we look right down at the birth rate, the under 15s, the numbers of children on the island are plummeting. We've got the lowest birth rate in decades currently. And so what we're seeing is families are deciding not to have children or not to have additional children. And when we started investigating that, it is about when you are a young working family, just the cost of living on island, the cost of childcare, the impact that it has on careers is all huge. And so our package of support was really around saying, will help out families specifically. And we've seen targeted help like that before. So when the cost of living crisis hit, there were like lump sums given to those that were receiving child benefit, which was intended to be family support. I think this is a much wider range of measures that will have a much bigger impact than just those one-off payments could.
And is this the sort of thing that actually works? I mean, have you, as a committee, have you actually looked at evidence from other places and saw, well, yes, this works there, and that's really effective, or is this just wishful thinking on the part of the committee?
No, we have looked, and it does make. We can look and you can see economic indicators for women returning to work and things after they've had a child, because they know a year they'll be able to access childcare. We looked at the Scottish model for the Sure Start payments, so it would be a payment before baby's born, before they start nursery, before they start primary school, secondary school, those expensive bits where you have to get X amount of school uniform all in one go, and that makes a real difference to those families. A very simple form to apply for it, but makes a real difference at those times when children suddenly cost substantially more. School shoes, I don't think have got cheaper in years and years and years. So all of those things, we've found evidence from elsewhere that they were measures that worked. If I'm really honest, I don't think I expected to get agreement on all of them. So if I achieved not very much else in my political career, I think this afternoon would have been the biggest single difference that I could have made to working families on the island.
So in 3 years' time, a number of members of the House of Keys will be dusting down their manifestos and looking to create new ones for the forthcoming 2026 election. Is any of this actually going to have happened by then? Or are we actually going to see any real impact from what's been agreed today in Tynwald?
I'm anticipating that some things like the uplift in child benefit for second and subsequent children should come through reasonably fast. I know I spoke with the Treasury Minister and they've worked out costed plans for all of this. It runs to millions of pounds, and I'm very grateful for the work that he's done. I think he estimated that the childcare voucher cost is about £7 million. But not everyone will be able to take it up straight away. We know there's a slight restriction on nursery places at the moment, but hopefully this then creates that environment that opening up a nursery in a town or a village is actually financially viable because more families can access that service. And so it becomes one of those build it and they'll come kind of situations. So not all of that cost kicks in straight away, but I know that I've got the commitment from the Treasury Minister that he will start moving on this as soon as possible. So I absolutely hope that within the 3 years we've seen substantial moves.
That was Michelle Hayward, MHK, Chair of Tynwald's Population Rebalancing Committee. Treasury Minister Alex Allinson shared some of the Tynwald's limelight this week. We'll hear about Treasury's penny-pinching proposals shortly, but first, the Treasury plan, which was roundly criticised on last week's show for being light on detail and what guests described as the public finance crisis.
Well, first of all, I disagree that there's a crisis in public finance, but there seemed to be a bit of confusion. We have a budget once a year, and I'm going to be giving a financial statement in July Tynwald. That's about overall financial policy for the Isle of Man, and that's extremely important. It's extremely important that we aim towards a balanced budget, but I made it quite clear in February that we were drawing down on reserves to absolutely ensure we had the money for essential public services, particularly health and education. Now, the departmental plans, and Mr. Morehouse asked, what's the point of them? The point is scrutiny from the Court of Tynwald. The point is it has to be detailed, because what I want from honourable members is for them to check that what we said we were going to do last year we've done, what we're going to do for this year, and how we're going to move ahead. So departmental plans were established by the Chief Minister when he was elected as a way that each of the ministers would stand up once a year in Tynwald and prove their point, prove why they were in a position, prove what their department was doing, and be able to take questions from honourable members. And the two are slightly separate. So it's absolutely right that in the departmental plan I talk about what we're doing in the department to make applying for benefits more easy, what we do in terms of responding to people's complaints about rates or income tax bills, how we're going to digitalise things, how we're going to encourage more people people to go online, how we're going to deal with things like FIRSA and the VAT sharing agreement and the surveys we're doing at the moment. But it's really up to the budget to set out that long-term financial strategy and to make sure that we're keeping to what we've said in the budget, which is the medium-term financial plan, and coming back into a balanced budget in 5 years. So the two are slightly different, but equally important to have that scrutiny from the court.
And in terms then of the detail, everyone has their own idea as to what a crisis might be. You don't believe we have a crisis in public finances, but something in the region of 10% of the expenditure of government in this current year is coming out of reserves. That's a big amount of money. So what are the specifics? What are the details in the Treasury plan that are going to address that?
Well, in the Treasury plan, it's that we collect income tax, that we collect VAT, that we reinforce our customs and excise department, that we digitalise, but also in terms of the threats to the Isle of Man from across, that we look at money val assessments, that we look at our international obligations in terms of the OECD pillars, that we do all that as well. And that's what's in the department plan, how we're actually going to affect it. But what's in the budget is the rationale about why we're drawing down from reserves. We've had a series of rainy days over the last couple of years. And again, Mr. Ashford pointed out that he doubted whether we were going to achieve what we've absolutely committed to, which is a balanced budget. Actually, he and his predecessors would probably have achieved that, and that's what they set out similar 5-year plans. But things have happened, and we've drawn down on reserves, I think quite rightly, because the alternative to drawing down on reserves is a period of mass austerity. And again, previous administrations have had to do that when VAT was rebalanced. And we've seen the effects of that. And actually, this administration in some ways is picking up some of the results of that, particularly when you look at problems with health funding, education funding, the state of the constabulary. All those you can trace back to the tightening that was done absolutely for the right reasons at that time, but has then cut down on public services. We need to grow the economy. That's what the economic plan is for. We need to grow the active working population. Again, that feeds into it. And that way we can actually grow ourselves out of the current issues we have in terms of the amount of expenditure that Tynwald wants and the amount of revenue that we can take from people and from companies on this island.
Alex Allinson, the penny pincher. There's various press releases been going out about a consultation to get rid of pennies, tuppences and 5-penny pieces. Is it fair to say that you're interested in the pennies but not so worried about the pounds?
I'm very interested in the pounds and less worried about the pennies. But the reality is it now costs more to mint a penny coin than it's worth. And so if in terms of taxpayers' money, is that right? Should we still be minting coins and they cost more than they're worth? And that's the reality we've got. We've also got large amounts of small coins lying around in storage, and we're having to pay for it to be stored. So I think it's absolutely right that we look at that situation. I'm glad that over 400 people have taken part in the consultation. It's ending at the end of this month, so people have still got time to take part. But it's asking people, do you still want pennies and tuppennies and 5p pieces in your pockets? Because if we do, that there is an expense to that. And is that the right use of public money? If you don't, then we can get rid of them, or perhaps we don't mint anymore. And there may be shortages from time to time of small change. But I think we have to look at that in the round, because it would be irresponsible of me to waste public money just to give you a little bit of shrapnel in your pocket.
In relation to Jason Moorhouse's motion calling for the removal of a dispensation to uninhabitable properties, basically a rate freeze is given to owners of properties once they become uninhabitable. Treasury came forward with a very clever and helpful amendment which basically says, well, we're kind of already on the case, we're doing a lot of this anyway, and nothing to see here, move along please. During the debate, though, there were several comments made referring to motions, questions made back in 2001, 2005 on this very issue. And here we are 20 years on, and we're still talking about it.
Well, I disagree with your interpretation of the motion. It wasn't a smokescreen. Actually, it was clear commitment. In our island plan, we've already set out that we'll look at how we can bring empty and dilapidated buildings back into use. We know, and I know as a previous Ramsey Town Commissioner, that vacant buildings, derelict buildings are a blight on our landscape. They are disrespectful to their neighbours, who often get in contact with me saying, look, we can't do anything. We're getting water coming in from next door, but there's nobody in to turn the taps off. That, it's a real issue, I think, for a lot of local communities. And you're quite right that previously Treasury have looked at it and thought perhaps it's a bit too difficult. You've got to bring discretion, you've got to have appeals. Each individual case needs to be dealt with, because sometimes it is for good reason. Somebody might have been in hospital or they might have passed away and you can't find the relatives. But what we've done today is absolutely commit to look at the legislation, work with the Attorney General's chambers to come back to Tynwald in November with some clear recommendations of how we're going to take this forward and change the law so that people who get zero-rated status on their properties have to do something to bring them back into use, that it's not a blank cheque that they can lay empty. More than that, we need to look at financial incentives to get the properties back into use, and disincentives as well. So should we have financial penalties, whether they're taxation, something else we can do to try to incentivise this? Because if we're looking at trying to increase the amount of affordable accessible housing, if we're looking at trying to help small businesses become established, some of these empty properties are ripe for development, and we should do everything we can do to enable local authorities to achieve that.
That was the Treasury Minister's view. Rob Collister, MHK, spent some years as an Onken Commissioner and has experience of trying to tackle the problem of empty and dilapidated properties. What was his take on the debate?
I was extremely grateful that my colleague Jason Morehouse brought this important motion. Unfortunately, the wording wasn't correct, and that's why I also supported the amendment brought by Dr. Allinson. There are 5 dilapidated properties in Onken, one in particular in 3rd Avenue, which has been an absolute blight on our community for far too long. That is how I got into really trying to serve the constituents. However, when you actually break this down, there is something called the Building Control Act under Section 24. The local authorities can enforce a homeowner to do some work. But when you actually look at it and they start to use significant taxpayers' money to go after somebody, you know the system isn't right, you know the legislation isn't right. And I want to see some firm action. And I think the motion from Mr. Morehouse to remove the exemption is one good tool. And in my speech, I talked about Scotland, where Scotland has removed the exemption, but also applied a 100% increase after a year on certain properties. And I think that's a very simple, very fair system to give people time to get the work done if they need to between day 1 and day 365. Thereafter, if there is extreme circumstance, they can apply for an exemption, but thereafter they pay rates. And that should encourage some of these properties that have been left empty, that are absolute blight on our community, get them back into circulation, because we need those properties.
And, of course, as we've heard on previous programmes, there was something, over 6,000 empty properties. Now, some of those will be empty properties that we know are in the process of being refurbished, but there's still likely several thousand properties on the island empty at a time when, certainly 2 years ago, when you were all being elected to the House of Keys, we were talking about a housing crisis.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be careful about using that 6,000 figure, because there are genuine reasons why properties are empty. There could be deaths within a family, which there are estate issues. There are, as I say, planning issues. There are a lot of developers out there who are very keen to get things back into circulation, but are finding the hurdles within planning. So what I'm trying to do is introduce a system that is very fair, very transparent. You have 365 days to undertake the work. If it's not, and you haven't got an exceptional reason, you'll start to pay rates thereafter in order to get these properties circulated. But my focus needs to be on long-term vacant and empty properties, dilapidated properties and ruinous properties. Focus on them. I've also mentioned in my speech that we should also give local authorities, and this is a local authority function. This government needs to give local authorities the powers and one of the other things I've asked for is to lift that corporate veil in order to be able to hold those property owners fully to account to carry out those repairs or to sell the property or to get it back into circulation.
Treasury's amendment, because it was moved by the Treasury Minister, and of course the Treasury Minister has every right to have an interest in this from both constituency but also from the Treasury perspective, in as much as effectively the motion was Tynwald supports the Treasury doing a load of work, so you can kind of see why the Treasury then came back with, well, actually, government's already busy doing quite a lot of stuff, and let's leave it to government to crack on. So in essence, the amended motion is more of the same. We're carrying on doing what we were doing before, and the issue of tackling the rates isn't really specifically referred to in the amendment now.
No, I think, myself personally, I think the Housing and Community Board have been far too slow in engaging some of these problems, but I do put on record my sincere thanks, as I said in the chamber, to Mr. Thomas and the members of the Housing and Community Board for considering now engaging an empty property officer, which is one of the original recommendations from the 2001 report. In respect of the Dr. Allinson's amendment, I'm happy to support them because it does give a very timeline that he has to come back at the end of October, and I'm happy to support that. If I find there is more hurdles or stumbles along the way, then I will be going further myself personally, because I know from listening to so many of my own constituents in Onken, they want the 5 dilapidated properties in Onken dealt with. And I think if you speak to my colleagues in Ramsey, who have a lot more than any other local authority, and in Douglas, they also want some of these properties turned around and put back into circulation. Why are we spending so much money building new properties on the island when we should be addressing and maximising the properties that we already have laying empty, when most of those, or some of them, can be recirculated and recycled and put back into circulation?
Bill Henderson talked about his motion back in 2001 to try and address this problem. Dawn Kinnish even very generously quoted a question that I asked of the then Treasury Minister back in 2005, very much along the lines of starting to penalise property owners, developers who effectively leave dilapidated properties in the hearts of our community. So we're at least 18 years on from my question, and 22 years on from Bill Henderson's motion. Why do you think it's so difficult to crack this particular nut?
I don't think it is a difficult nut to crack. I think what's happened over time is the fact that there hasn't been much appetite. I think most people who need housing, if it's social or private, it's been available, including private rentals. They've always been available. I think now we know from the data that less people are living in each property. That is a continuing trend over the last 15 to 20 years. So what we are now needing is to look at building new housing. But if we are going to build new houses, then we've got to think about the current housing stock. Have we got enough of it? Have we got too many properties lying idle? And they are a blight on our landscape. Is there any of those that we can actually turn around? And in order to do that, we need to put pressure on the property owners, but also give them the support. And if that support means trying to look at planning legislation in order to allow them to get these properties developed, then we should do it. I personally will be encouraging the Treasury Minister, when he comes back in October, to bring some real positives and proper staged approach of getting this problem solved in this administration.
That was Rob Collister, MHK. Just time to squeeze in Chris Thomas on what's happening to the Lord Street development. Often promised, but decades on, still not delivered.
I think what this government did was they set up the Manx Development Corporation, then they established an island infrastructure scheme. They've talked about a priority being Lower Douglas, and I do hope that the private developer can make an announcement soon about how they're successful, whether they made an application, whether they were successful, and what their plans are now for that site. I can absolutely assure people that DOI has bent over backwards to be helpful to all those private developers. So we've been talking from our highways section about highways and junctions, and from a public transport section we've been making sure we get our bus facilities, which is an information centre, toilets, new bus stops as soon as possible. And we're also responsible for that Section 13 obligation, which creates funds to provide that bus centre in lieu of affordable housing. And so we have all sorts of axes. There's another another dimension to this, which is the parking. It used to be a car park, a paid car park. In recent years, the public will have noticed it's an unpaid car park. It's a free-for-all. That's because the owner of the site doesn't have permission to charge for car parking on that site. Temporarily, we gave them permission to use it as a car parking site during COVID. And what I talked about today was the developers got all sorts of questions to answer. One of those is to tell the Manx public what's going to happen, and the second one is to tell us what they plan to do about the parking on that site, which has to come to an end soon. In the years since 2020, the situation with hotels has changed. The government's not got much greater interest in housing, and so I would like to think, and we've been putting a lot of pressure in terms of parking and in terms of the bus facilities. So I would hope that the private developers hearing this and will come out and make their own announcement of their own business and their own future, because it absolutely matters to the people of the island, to our taxpayers, to ratepayers of Douglas, that we have development in Lower Douglas, and that's a particularly crucial site.
That's all for this week's Tynwald Roundup. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.